The sharp sound of a slap echoed through the grand lobby of the bank, silencing the chatter of customers and employees alike. Gasps filled the air as security grabbed the stunned woman, forcing her hands behind her back. Her face burned from the unexpected strike, but her expression remained calm, too calm. The bank manager, Steve Larson, smirked in satisfaction, convinced he had just put a troublesome customer in her place. He had no idea that the woman he had just humiliated owned the very bank he worked for. The security guard locked the handcuffs tightly around her wrists as customers whispered in disbelief. No one, not the employees, the security staff, or even the police who had just arrived, knew that they were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. Because in just a few moments, the truth would come out, and justice would be served. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe for more powerful real-life stories. Monica Caldwell remained still as the cold metal of the handcuffs tightened around her wrists. The entire bank lobby was frozen in stunned silence, customers watching in disbelief as security restrained her like a criminal. But Monica's calm expression never wavered. She wasn't just any customer. She was the CEO of Caldwell Financial Group, the company that owned this very bank. The humiliation she had just endured would soon become the biggest regret of everyone involved. Steve Larson, the arrogant bank manager, straightened his tie with a smug look of satisfaction. He had seen customers like her before, people who didn't look the part, who didn't belong in a place like this. He had made it his unspoken mission to weed out those he deemed undesirable, and today was no different. He turned to his employees who stood frozen behind their desks. "This is what happens when you try to pull a scam," he sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. A few customers whispered among themselves, uneasy with the way the situation had escalated, but none dared to speak up. What no one realized was that Monica hadn't walked into this bank by chance. She had come here undercover, dressed in casual clothes, deliberately avoiding the professional image she was known for. She wanted to see firsthand how her customers, especially minorities, were being treated in her banks. And from the moment she walked in, she had noticed the red flags. Customers who looked like her were kept waiting longer. Their requests met with more scrutiny. Employees subtly steered them away from premium services, assuming they weren't qualified. And now, here she was, experiencing the very discrimination she had suspected was happening. As Monica remained restrained, another man stepped through the bank's glass doors, Anthony Davis, her senior executive and trusted right-hand man. He had arrived for a routine check-in at the branch, but the moment he saw Monica in handcuffs, his face darkened. The tension in the air was palpable as he quickly assessed the situation. His eyes flickered between Monica's calm yet piercing gaze and the security guard standing over her. Then they landed on Steve Larson. Steve turned and noticed Anthony, his smug expression faltering for the first time. He knew Anthony was a high-ranking executive, but wasn't aware of the full extent of his authority. He hesitated before speaking. "Sir, we had a situation here. This woman was being uncooperative. She refused to provide proper identification and was causing a disturbance." Anthony's icy stare cut him off mid-sentence. He turned to Monica, whose hands were still bound. "Miss Caldwell," he said, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable weight. "Are you all right?" The room shifted instantly. Employees who had been too afraid to react suddenly seemed to realize who she was. Customers who had witnessed the mistreatment watched intently, their phones discreetly raised, recording the unfolding moment. Something was about to happen, and no one wanted to miss it. Monica finally spoke, her voice smooth, controlled. I was about to leave, but apparently Mr. Larson and his staff had other plans. She turned her gaze to Steve, who was beginning to sweat. The entire room now hung on her every word. The power was shifting, and Steve Larson had no idea just how badly he had messed up. The tension in the bank lobby was suffocating as Monica Caldwell, now freed from the handcuffs, slowly rubbed her wrists. The security guard who had restrained her stood frozen, his face drained of color, while the police officers shifted uncomfortably, realizing the mistake they had nearly made. Steve Larson, the bank manager, could feel the weight of the stares piercing through him. The once smug confidence he carried had completely vanished. His mouth was dry, and his mind raced for an explanation, any explanation, that could undo the disaster he had just created. Anthony Davis remained standing by Monica's side, his expression unreadable. But his presence alone sent an unspoken message. This was not going to be brushed under the rug. Monica inhaled deeply, her gaze never leaving Steve's. "Mr. Larson," she said, her voice calm but unwavering, "let's talk about your future." The silence in the room was deafening. Employees, customers, and even bystanders who had simply come to deposit checks or inquire about loans were now completely focused on the confrontation unfolding before them. Many of them had their phones raised, capturing every second of what was happening. Steve's mind scrambled to regain control. He straightened his tie, forcing out a nervous chuckle. "Miss Caldwell, this whole situation is just a misunderstanding. Had I known who you were, of course, none of this would have happened." He gestured vaguely toward the shaken security guard. "I was just doing my job, ensuring that our policies are followed. There was nothing personal about it." Monica's eyes narrowed slightly. "Nothing personal?" she repeated, tilting her head as if considering his words. "So tell me, Mr. Larson, when was the last time you personally supervised a transaction at this bank? When was the last time you intervened in a withdrawal request and assumed fraud before hearing an explanation?" She let the questions hang in the air, watching as Steve struggled for a response. He swallowed hard. I only step in when something seems suspicious." A faint smile crossed Monica's lips, but it wasn't one of amusement. "Suspicious?" she echoed. "Let's break that down, shall we? I walked in today just like any other customer. I waited in line. I made a request for a withdrawal. And instead of being treated like a valued client, I was humiliated, insulted, and physically assaulted. And what exactly made me suspicious, Mr. Larson? Was it my demeanor, my request? Or was it the fact that I didn't look like the type of person you expect to have money in this bank?" Steve's face was a mixture of frustration and panic. He opened his mouth, but Monica cut him off with a sharp glance. "Because let's be clear," she continued, "if I had walked in here looking the way you assume a wealthy client should look, I wouldn't have been questioned. I wouldn't have been asked for additional identification. I wouldn't have been treated like a criminal." Murmurs spread through the crowd, many nodding in agreement. Some of the customers, especially those who had been ignored or treated with less respect, now felt emboldened by Monica's words. The truth had been spoken, and there was no taking it back. Steve was visibly sweating now, but he made one last desperate attempt to justify his actions. "I was only following bank policy," he stammered. "You must understand, we deal with fraud all the time. We have to be cautious." Monica's expression darkened. "You think I don't understand bank policies?" she asked, her voice laced with quiet authority. I created them. Steve visibly flinched at those words. He knew he had no defense. Monica exhaled and folded her arms. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, her tone steady. "You, Mr. Larson, are relieved of your duties, effective immediately. I will not tolerate discriminatory behavior in a company that bears my name." A heavy silence fell over the room. Steve stood frozen, his mouth slightly open in shock. You can't just fire me like that," he sputtered. Monica raised an eyebrow. "Oh," she said, tilting her head. "You seem to think you have authority here. Let me remind you, you work for me." She turned to the security guard who had assaulted her. "And as for you," she continued, "you are also terminated, effective immediately. I suggest you reconsider how you treat people in the future." The security guard's face paled. His hands trembled slightly as he processed the reality of what had just happened. Monica then turned to the remaining staff. "For the rest of you," she said, her voice ringing with finality, "I will be conducting an internal audit of this branch and every other location under Caldwell Financial Group. If I find evidence of discriminatory practices, you will not be given second chances. Consider this your wake-up call." A hush fell over the employees. Some looked ashamed, while others seemed relieved that action was finally being taken. Customers murmured their approval, some even clapping quietly. Monica glanced around, taking in the expressions of everyone present. She had made her point. Turning back to Steve, she gave him one last look. "You said this wasn't personal," she said. "For me, it is. Because no one should have to walk into a place like this and be treated the way I was today." And with that, she turned on her heel and walked out, Anthony by her side. Behind her, Steve Larson stood frozen, knowing he had just lost everything. Monica Caldwell strode out of the bank lobby, her head held high, leaving behind a room full of stunned employees and customers. The weight of her words still lingered in the air, and the reality of what had just transpired was finally settling in. Steve Larson stood frozen, his face pale, his mind racing to process the fact that he had just been fired, on the spot in front of the entire bank. The very woman he had humiliated, arrested, and dismissed as an unimportant customer had turned out to be the CEO of the entire financial group. A tense silence stretched across the room as security officers avoided eye contact, knowing they had made a grave mistake. Customers whispered among themselves, some with quiet satisfaction, others still in shock. Employees looked uneasy, realizing that their jobs might not be as secure as they once thought. The remaining bank staff, particularly those who had stayed silent as the injustice unfolded, exchanged uncertain glances. They had watched it happen, done nothing to stop it, and now their boss had made it clear there would be consequences for allowing discrimination to thrive under her name. Steve finally snapped out of his daze, turning toward Monica as she reached the front doors. His pride wouldn't let him leave without trying to salvage what little dignity he had left. He took a step forward, his voice shaking, but still laced with entitlement. "Miss Caldwell, wait. This isn't fair. You can't just fire me like this. I deserve a chance to explain." Monica stopped but didn't turn around immediately. She let his words hang in the air before slowly pivoting to face him. Her expression was unreadable, her posture unwavering. "A chance?" she repeated, tilting her head slightly. "A chance to do what, Mr. Larson?" "Justify why you humiliated me in front of an entire bank. Why you had security put their hands on me for simply making a withdrawal." Steve's mouth opened, but no words came out. He had spent years in control, lording his authority over customers and employees alike, but now, stripped of his power, he had nothing left to say. Monica continued, her voice sharp yet composed. "Tell me, Mr. Larson, if I hadn't been the CEO, if I had just been a regular customer, what would have happened today? Would you have apologized? Or would you have let me be taken away in handcuffs, accused of a crime I didn't commit, simply because you assumed I wasn't supposed to be here?" Steve swallowed hard. He knew the answer, and so did everyone else in the room. He wouldn't have apologized. He wouldn't have reconsidered his actions. He would have gone home that evening, feeling triumphant that he had removed another undesirable from his bank. But today, he was the one being removed. Monica shook her head, disappointment evident in her eyes. You don't get to beg for fairness after denying it to others. She turned toward Anthony Davis, who had been standing by her side, watching everything unfold. "Make sure his termination is official before the end of the day. I don't want him near any Caldwell financial institution ever again." Anthony nodded, pulling out his phone to make the necessary calls. Steve's confidence crumbled. Panic set in as he took another step forward, lowering his voice. "Miss Caldwell, please. I've worked here for years. I made a mistake, I admit it, but I have a family to take care of." Monica's expression remained unmoved. "So do the people you've mistreated," she replied. "How many customers have you denied opportunities because you assumed they weren't worthy? How many employees have you silenced, dismissed, or pushed out because they didn't fit your image of success?" She let the questions hang in the air. If I give you a second chance, what message does that send? That discrimination is only punishable when it happens to someone in power? Steve had no response. His fate was sealed. But Monica wasn't done yet. She turned toward the staff who had stood idly by as the incident unfolded. "And the rest of you," she said, scanning their faces. Some looked ashamed, others nervous. "You watched it happen. You let it happen." She pointed toward a young teller, the one who had initially refused to process her transaction. "You could have spoken up. You could have stopped this before it escalated. But you didn't. Why?" The teller stammered, shifting nervously. I was just following orders," she mumbled. Monica's eyes darkened. "That excuse doesn't work anymore," she said. "You don't get to hide behind policy when what's happening is wrong." She sighed and turned toward Anthony again. "I want a full report on this branch by tomorrow. I want to know exactly how many customers have filed complaints about mistreatment and how many employees have been part of this culture of discrimination. And I want names." Anthony nodded firmly. "Consider it done." Monica turned back to Steve, her final words cutting through the air like a blade. "Your actions had consequences. Today, you face them." Then, with a final glance at the staff, she added, "And let this be a warning to everyone else. This bank, and every branch under Caldwell Financial, will be run with integrity. If you can't be part of that change, you won't be part of this company." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving behind a room full of stunned employees and customers. Steve Larson stood frozen, his career in ruins, his pride shattered. He had spent years believing he was untouchable. But today, he had learned a hard truth. No one is above accountability. Steve Larson stood frozen in the middle of the bank, his mind numb as Monica Caldwell disappeared through the glass doors. His entire world had collapsed in a matter of minutes. The power he had wielded for years, the unquestioned authority he had used to intimidate customers and employees, was now gone. The whispers of customers and employees filled the air, but their words were distant echoes to him. He had thought he controlled this place, but the truth had hit him harder than he could process. He never had control at all. Meanwhile, Monica walked toward the sidewalk outside, her heels clicking against the pavement with each step. Anthony Davis followed closely behind, his phone buzzing in his hand as he coordinated immediate internal reviews of not just this branch, but every single Caldwell Financial location. She had made herself a promise. What had happened today would never happen again, not in her company, not under her leadership. This bank wasn't just a place for financial transactions. It was supposed to be a pillar of trust, of security. If discrimination had seeped into the culture, then it was her responsibility to root it out. Back inside, the security guard who had slapped Monica was still trying to process what had just happened. His hands trembled slightly as he realized the gravity of his actions. His badge, once a symbol of power, now felt like a burden. He had restrained and assaulted a woman who wasn't just any customer. She was the one who signed his paychecks. He turned to Steve, looking for guidance, but there was none to be found. Steve's expression was blank, lost, his mind desperately grasping for a way to undo the damage, but there was none. A moment later, one of the officers who had nearly taken Monica into custody stepped forward, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Mr. Larson," he said hesitantly, "do you want us to escort you out?" Steve blinked, his pride flaring for a brief second. "Escort me out?" "This is my—" He stopped himself. It wasn't his bank, not anymore. His throat tightened as he saw some of his own employees looking at him with pity, some with relief. He had spent years demanding respect, enforcing fear, but now he had lost everything. Outside, Monica took a deep breath, letting the fresh air cool the heat that still burned in her cheeks. The slap hadn't just been physical, it had been symbolic. She had walked into her own bank to see how customers were treated, and in return, she had been treated like she didn't belong. The experience had stung, but in many ways, it was exactly what she needed to see. Because if it could happen to her, the owner of the bank, then how many others had suffered the same treatment without justice? She turned to Anthony. "We're doing a full audit," she said firmly. "I want every branch under our name reviewed. Secret evaluations, undercover inspections, whatever it takes to find out where this culture of discrimination is coming from." Anthony nodded. "Already on it," he assured her. "But what about Steve? Are we pursuing legal action?" Monica considered it for a moment before shaking her head. "No," she said. "His punishment is already more than he ever imagined. He built his career on power, on making people feel small. Now, he has to walk out of here with nothing, and the whole world is going to know why." Back in the bank, Steve finally moved. Shoulders hunched, he walked toward his office, but an employee stepped forward. "Sir," she said, her voice laced with unease, "Ms. Caldwell said you need to leave the premises immediately." Steve clenched his jaw. "And if I don't?" he asked, his voice quiet but sharp. The woman didn't flinch. "Then security will remove you." A bitter laugh escaped Steve's lips. "Security?" he muttered. "You mean the same security that just got fired?" But it didn't matter. He could see it in their eyes. His reign was over. As he took his final steps out of the bank, passing by employees who had once followed his every order, he realized something that made his stomach sink. He had always believed his power came from his position, but today he understood. True power comes from respect. And respect was something he had never truly earned. Steve Larson walked away from the bank, his shoulders hunched, his mind spinning with disbelief. The world he had carefully built around himself, his authority, his control, his untouchable status, had crumbled in a single moment. The employees he had once commanded with fear no longer looked at him with respect. Instead, they watched him with a mixture of pity and relief. The customers who had once been beneath his notice now whispered his name with satisfaction, knowing justice had been served. As he reached his car, he hesitated for a moment, gripping the door handle. He had thought he was powerful, but now he finally understood what real power looked like. And it wasn't him. Inside the bank, the tension that had once filled the air had begun to dissipate. Employees looked around, exchanging uncertain glances. The weight of Steve Larson's oppressive rule was gone, but in its place was something unfamiliar: accountability. For years, many of them had turned a blind eye to the way customers were treated, either out of fear or indifference. But today, they had seen the consequences firsthand. They had witnessed what true leadership looked like. And it wasn't in the form of intimidation. It was in the form of integrity. Some of them wondered if they, too, would be held responsible for allowing discrimination to persist unchecked. Outside, Monica Caldwell stood near the entrance, watching as the glass doors slowly closed behind her. The slap she had endured earlier no longer stung, but the memory of it remained fresh in her mind. It wasn't the physical pain that lingered. It was the reality of what it represented. If this had happened to her, the owner of the bank, then how many other customers had been mistreated? How many had been denied services, spoken down to, or made to feel unworthy? The thought ignited something in her, a determination that this would not be just another incident. It would be the turning point. She turned to Anthony Davis, who was already making notes on his phone. He didn't need to ask what came next. He knew exactly what Monica was thinking. "We're not stopping here, are we?" he asked, glancing up at her. Monica shook her head. "Not even close." She folded her arms, her expression resolute. "I want an immediate company-wide audit. Every branch under Caldwell Financial is going to be evaluated. If there's even a hint of discrimination, we're cleaning house." Anthony nodded. "I'll have teams start investigating immediately. We'll do undercover inspections, gather customer reports, and review employee complaints. We'll find every weak link in the system." Monica inhaled deeply before exhaling. "And we're making this public. This isn't going to be handled quietly behind closed doors. I want the world to know that Caldwell Financial isn't just talking about change, we're enforcing it." Anthony arched an eyebrow. "That's going to shake things up." Monica's lips curled into a knowing smirk. "Good." Inside the bank, employees continued murmuring, the weight of what had happened settling in. Some of them had worked under Steve for years, fully aware of his behavior but never daring to speak out. Others had turned a blind eye, justifying their silence as survival. But now, they knew silence was no longer an option. The new era of Caldwell Financial had begun, and they would have to make a choice: be part of the solution or be left behind. As news of the incident spread, it took on a life of its own. The footage of Monica's wrongful arrest went viral, sparking public outrage and forcing conversations about racial discrimination in corporate environments. Customers shared their own experiences at various bank branches, confirming that what had happened to Monica was not an isolated event. The world was watching now, waiting to see what Caldwell Financial would do next. Days later, Monica sat in her office at the company's headquarters, reviewing reports from the first round of internal investigations. The results were both expected and infuriating. There was indeed a pattern of discrimination at certain locations. Some managers had intentionally discouraged minority clients from applying for high-value loans, while others had flagged specific customers for extra scrutiny based on nothing more than their appearance. It was worse than she had imagined, but it only strengthened her resolve. Anthony walked in, placing another stack of reports on her desk. The retraining programs have started. Any employees refusing to participate are being terminated immediately. He sat across from her, folding his hands. You made a lot of people nervous, Monica. But you also made a lot of people hopeful. Monica tapped her fingers against the desk, staring at the reports. We're not just cleaning up bad employees, Anthony. We're rebuilding trust. Caldwell Financial is supposed to be a place of opportunity, not exclusion. Anthony nodded. And under your leadership, that's exactly what it's going to be. Monica looked out the window, the city skyline stretching before her. What had started as a routine undercover visit had turned into something much bigger. This wasn't just about her wrongful arrest or Steve Larson's termination. This was about making a statement that discrimination had no place in her company and that real power came from ensuring fairness, not exploiting authority. For the first time in days, she allowed herself a small smile. This wasn't just a victory. It was a beginning. As Monica Caldwell gazed out of her office window, she reflected on everything that had unfolded. What had started as a simple undercover visit had turned into a powerful moment of accountability. The bank was no longer just a place of business. It had become a symbol of change. The reforms she had put in motion would ensure that no customer, regardless of background, would ever experience what she had gone through. True leadership wasn't just about making money. It was about making things right. Meanwhile, across the city, news of her decision had spread. Customers who had once been mistreated shared their stories, relieved that someone in power was finally taking action. Employees who had been afraid to speak up now felt empowered to do so. And as for Steve Larson, he had walked out of the bank with his head low, his power stripped away, forced to face the consequences of his actions. He had spent years believing that his authority was untouchable, but today he had learned that real power comes from respect, and respect must be earned. Some people think justice takes years, but Monica proved that one moment, one decision, can change everything. What do you think? Did Monica make the right decision? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more eye-opening real-life lessons. Because at the end of the day, true leadership isn't about control. It's about doing what's right. See you in the next one.